They say every empire is built on force, but history whispers something different. Power belongs to whoever can afford the bill. And that's where our story begins. Not with a king, not with a president, not with a central bank, but with a suspicion that has haunted generations of investors. If every headline screams about debt, why is no one asking who the creditor really is? Tell me in the comments. Do you believe the true financial power of the world is visible or hidden in plain sight? Because beneath the noise of stock markets and interest rate predictions, there is a silent ache shared by millions, a growing sense that an invisible owner, someone we never vote for, never see, never hear, quietly determines risk, crisis, and stability. Not through speeches, but through capital. What the public feels as confusion, visionary investors recognize as a pattern. The world doesn't revolve around the borrower who shouts, but the creditor who whispers. Most people imagine the global lender as a country, a superpower, or a famous bank. But the experienced eye knows the real power lies in mechanisms, in pools of savings, demographic tides, reserve flows, and incentives woven so deeply into the system that most people never notice them. Visionary investors see something the average market watcher can't: a web connecting aging societies, surplus savings, sovereign debt, and monetary interdependence. A web that decides who grows, who stagnates, and who ultimately pays the price. And that leads us to the question the financial world avoids. If every crisis is blamed on debt, why does no one ever ask about the creditor? To make sense of the present, we turn to a forgotten pattern in history, one that exposes a truth so unsettling that Rome itself preferred not to admit it. Historical analogy, only one, as requested. In the late Roman Empire, the capital was unknowingly financed by those it called peripheral. Tribes considered backward became the quiet buyers of Roman gold and Roman promises. They didn't storm the gates with armies, they conquered slowly, invisibly, through credit. Rome believed it controlled them. In reality, they controlled Rome's future. This same moral irony echoes in our modern system. Great powers project strength, but strength means little when your prosperity depends on someone else's savings. Today's visionary investors understand that before you study interest rates, you study where global savings come from. Before you analyze crises, you identify who must be rescued, and more importantly, who pays for the rescue. Before you judge a nation's dominance, you examine whether it relies on the discipline of others. This video is not about the obvious players. It's about the hidden architecture, the silent lender who shapes nations without ever stepping onto a battlefield. So let me ask you, do you think we truly know who finances the modern world? Or have we been looking in the wrong direction all along? Tell me below. The great irony of global finance is this: nations speak loudly about power, but whisper about dependence. Because the deepest fragility of any country, even the strongest, is moral, not military. No nation likes to admit that its prosperity rests on the credit of someone else. Yet every modern empire has lived under this quiet truth. The moral fragility of nations begins here. Debt is never just an economic tool. It is a confession. A confession that consumption outran production, that ambition exceeded discipline, that the future had to be borrowed because the present wasn't enough. And in that space between ambition and reality emerges a figure rarely discussed in public: the creditor as an invisible moral force. The borrower negotiates. The creditor defines the boundaries. The borrower hopes. The creditor sets the terms of hope itself. Visionary investors know this instinctively. Before they watch interest rates or central bank press conferences, they follow the origin of global savings, not because it's academic, but because it is the compass of power. Savings tell you who can wait. Debt tells you who cannot. The revelation that shocks newcomers, but never surprises the seasoned, is simple. The strongest nation is not the one that shouts the loudest, but the one whose society saves more than it consumes. Even if that nation is not a military giant, even if it lacks aircraft carriers, influence, or cultural dominance. In the hierarchy of global finance, the surplus saver outranks the deficit empire. And this insight reshapes the map of today's world, because the geography of aging, the decline of productivity, and the shifting distribution of savings are redrawing power lines more effectively than armies ever could. The new centers of influence are not always glamorous. They are sometimes old, sometimes quiet, often underestimated. But they hold something empires desperately need: the ability to fund tomorrow. If this reframes how you see the global order, tell me in the comments. Do you think national power today is built more on weapons or on savings? Every generation grows up believing that wealth is measured by how much a nation consumes. The cars it buys, the cities it builds, the lifestyle it displays to the world. But visionary investors know this is a comforting illusion, because real power doesn't come from what you spend, but from what you can afford to lend. That is the collective pain hidden beneath the modern economy. Entire societies equate prosperity with abundance, when the true currency of power has always been surplus savings. Consumption turns heads. Financing shapes empires. This is the heart of the concept often misunderstood as the global savings glut, treated by many as a distortion, a strange anomaly of global finance. But visionaries see it differently. To them, this excess savings is not a glitch. It is a disciplinary mechanism embedded in the world economy, a quiet force that restrains, shapes, and sometimes humiliates the very nations that believe they lead. Because countries that export savings don't just ship money abroad, they export influence. They mold the monetary policies of capital importers, those who rely on foreign savings to fund growth, consumption, or political promises. The headlines call it interdependence. The seasoned investor calls it leverage. And here lies the strategic paradox. The nations that appear dependent, the exporters, the quiet lenders, often hold more real power than those who dominate diplomatically, militarily, or culturally. They don't have to threaten. They don't have to impose. They simply have to decide whether to keep buying someone else's future. This leads to the invisible lesson rarely taught in economics textbooks. In the global arena, excess is stronger than exuberance. Surplus outlives spectacle. Patience outlasts noise. Visionary investors track this truth obsessively, not because it's elegant, but because it reveals where the real decisions are made. Not in speeches, not in summits, but in the quiet flows of capital moving from the world's savers to the world's spenders. Tell me in the comments, do you think the nations that lend quietly are more powerful than the nations that borrow loudly? Crises are often presented as moments of weakness, flashpoints that expose poor decisions, inflated markets, or reckless speculation. But visionary investors see something deeper. Crises don't just reveal vulnerabilities, they expose dependencies. Every financial shock answers a question most nations try to avoid. When everything burns, who holds the hose, and who owns the water? This is the recurring error of the mainstream narrative: to treat crises as isolated failures instead of windows into the architecture of power. Because in the moment of panic, when liquidity evaporates and institutions tremble, the system instinctively turns toward one figure: the creditor with the ability and the will to save it. Visionary investors study not only who collapses, but who must be rescued, and more importantly, by whom. That "by whom" is the fingerprint of global power. We saw this with rare clarity in 2008. The world called it an American crisis. Banks failed, markets froze, confidence cracked. But the salvation of the US financial system, the lifeline that stabilized the global economy, came from places almost no one expected. Foreign buyers of treasuries, surplus nations recycling capital back into the failing core. Countries whose savings were considered peripheral suddenly became essential. And while no shots were fired, a geopolitical price was quietly collected afterward. A slow rebalancing of influence, a shift in who could demand what from whom. This is the counterintuitive lesson that separates ordinary investors from those who understand power. The creditor's authority appears not in calm markets, but in the moment the debtor needs immediate liquidity to survive. And then comes the part few dare to admit. In crises, even great powers behave like distressed households, rushed, fearful, negotiating from weakness, their pride swallowed by urgency. Visionary investors call this moral panic, the psychological collapse that reveals who truly depends on whom. So I ask you, when a crisis hits a superpower and it looks outward for help, does it still remain a superpower? Comment your thoughts below. And then comes the part few dare to admit. In crises, even great powers behave like distressed households, rushed, fearful, negotiating from weakness, their pride swallowed by the urgency of the moment. Visionary investors call this moral panic, the psychological collapse that reveals who truly depends on whom. So I ask you, when a crisis hits a superpower and it looks outward for help, does it still remain a superpower? Comment your thoughts below. We love to tell ourselves that innovation triumphs on brilliance alone, that the best idea wins, that genius is destiny. But visionary investors know this is only half the story, because every revolution, from steam to silicon, began with a quieter force. Someone was willing to pay for it. This is the mental mistake repeated across generations. The belief that technological empires rise through creativity, when in truth, they rise through capital allocation. What becomes the future is not chosen in laboratories, but in the portfolios of those who control the world's savings. Visionary investors understand this with absolute clarity. Capital shapes the trajectory of innovation long before markets notice. Breakthroughs don't just emerge, they are financed, nurtured, and protected by those who can afford to wait years, sometimes decades, for a payoff. And here lies one of the least discussed dynamics of global power. Nations that control reserve allocation don't just manage risk, they determine which sectors thrive, which fade, and which become the foundation of tomorrow's economy. Today, the direction of entire industries, from clean energy to semiconductors, from AI to biotechnology, can be traced back to decisions made by countries and institutions quietly shifting their reserves into one sector and away from another. The public sees a boom, visionaries see a funding choice, and the paradox is almost poetic. Technological superpowers can be financially dependent on the very actors who don't innovate at all. The most advanced nations rely on savings generated far away by societies whose demographic cycles or cultural habits produce consistent surplus capital. The result is a moral irony. Those celebrated for progress may be standing on the shoulders of those who simply saved. This leads to the invisible moral error that distorts how governments and analysts interpret the world. They treat the origin of financing as a technical detail, when it is the seed of power, because whoever funds the future decides what the future becomes. Tell me in the comments, do you think innovation follows genius, or the money that backs it? If you want to understand the true architecture of power, don't look at balance sheets. Look at fear, because beneath every reserve strategy, every hedge position, every sudden flight into safe assets, there is a human truth older than banking itself, the pain of losing shapes, behavior far more than the thrill of gaining. This is the universal human ache that silently governs the world of sovereign wealth, pension funds, and global reserves. We talk about rational actors, efficient markets, optimal portfolios, but inside the minds of nations and investors, the emotional rule is always the same. Protect what you have first. And this is where the psychology of the global creditor becomes decisive. Because creditors, whether countries or institutions, operate not on mathematical neutrality, but on moral and psychological reflexes. They fear instability. They fear disorder. They fear that the assets they hold, the claims they've accumulated, might suddenly evaporate. And so they preserve systems not out of benevolence, but out of self-preservation. They stabilize the world not because it is noble, but because chaos would destroy the very wealth they built. Visionary investors track this psychology obsessively. They watch not only interest rates, but the emotional indicators hidden in reserve movements, in hedging strategies, in the silent migration towards safe harbors. Gold, treasuries, defensive currencies, energy reserves. These shifts are not numbers, they are signals, traces of fear, warnings of what the global creditor truly believes is coming. And from this emerges one of the most powerful insights in macroeconomics. Understanding the creditor's fear lets you anticipate global movements months before they ever appear in official forecasts. Because when the creditor retreats, the world follows. Every great power eventually falls in love with its own currency. The world demands it, trades with it, saves in it. And slowly, subtly, the issuing nation begins to believe a dangerous myth, that dominance equals independence. This is the recurring moral failure of global hegemons. They mistake privilege for invulnerability. They believe that because their currency is the backbone of global trade and finance, they alone control the system. But visionary investors see the flaw instantly. Even the dominant currency, the one held in reserves, priced into commodities, trusted for decades, depends on something humbling: a loyal, disciplined, and predictable buyer. The issuer may set the policy. The world must choose to accept it. And that choice is never guaranteed. This is the structural dependence great powers prefer not to speak of. You can print your currency, but you cannot print demand for it. You can issue debt, but someone must decide to hold it. Monetary dominance is not the same as monetary sovereignty, not when your strength relies on the steady hand of the global creditor. Visionary investors look for the inflection point, the moment when the issuer's confidence quietly becomes hostage to the creditor's appetite. A subtle shift in who buys long-term bonds, a demographic shock in a surplus nation, a change in savings behavior half a world away. These are the tremors that precede geopolitical change, because the profile of buyers matters. And when the character of those buyers shifts, you can forecast a decade of power realignment. This leads to the lesson that great powers often learn too late. The dominant currency does not survive on prestige. It survives on trust, the trust of the creditor who keeps the system funded. Every society tells itself stories to hide its weaknesses. Some build myths around greatness. Others blame foreign rivals. Most construct narratives of progress to conceal a simple truth. Consuming more than you produce is a moral choice before it is an economic one. This is the cultural pain embedded in modern prosperity. We celebrate lifestyles funded by debt, we frame consumption as success, and we mask structural fragility with patriotic confidence. But the global creditor sees through all of it, because the creditor is not just a financier, it is a mirror reflecting the priorities we refuse to confront, our imbalance between work and reward, our impatience with saving, our reliance on someone else's discipline to fund our aspirations. And here lies a striking psychological insight. Nations behave exactly like individuals in debt. They externalize blame, they rationalize imbalance, they accuse others of manipulation, exploitation, unfair advantage, all to avoid acknowledging the uncomfortable truth. Someone else is financing their lifestyle. This leads to the provocative question at the heart of this chapter. Does the creditor reveal more about its own power, or about our inability to live within our means? Visionary investors know the answer. They study not only the lender's strength, but the borrower's moral contradictions. Because in the long cycle of history, every era of prosperity rests on an invisible creditor, until the day the bill arrives and the illusion collapses. The creditor does not expose flaws intentionally. It simply acts according to its incentives. But its existence forces us to confront the paradox at the core of modern economies. We demand independence while relying on someone else's savings, and the historical synthesis is unavoidable. Every golden age, Roman, Dutch, British, American, was supported by a silent lender whose patience eventually ran out. Let me know in the comments. Do you think societies today are ready to face the truths their creditors reveal? Or will we keep hiding behind comforting narratives? We've followed the trail that most headlines ignore. The quiet path of savings, dependence, and power that shapes the modern world. And when you step back, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The true forces steering the global economy rarely sit where public discourse places them. The loudest nations, the ones celebrated as engines of growth, often stand on foundations built by others. Because power in the modern era is not loud, it's lent. And every era of prosperity is financed by someone willing to wait while others rush ahead. That is the first silent truth. Real power rarely stands at the podium. It sits in the balance sheet. The second truth is psychological. Creditor nations do not simply control capital. They control the emotional climate of the world. Confidence, fear, expectation. When they move, markets tremble. When they retreat, systems crack. When they hesitate, entire nations feel the chill. And the final truth is moral. Hegemony is not about armies or technology. It is about who can finance the world when the world can no longer finance itself. To understand the creditor is to understand the future, because the creditor decides how long a system survives, which nations can pretend to be independent, and which dreams will be funded or abandoned. This story ends where all economic stories begin, with the choices societies make about discipline, savings, and truth. In the end, the global creditor is not only a force outside us, it is a reflection of what we prioritize, what we avoid, and what we refuse to confront. Final analogy, one only, as requested. Just as the great navigators of the 16th century crossed oceans without ever owning the ships they sailed, their voyages were made possible by financiers who never touched the sea, yet decided which worlds would be discovered. Today's global creditor holds that same quiet power, charting the future from the shore while the world sails on borrowed time. So, I leave you with two questions. Who truly steers the global economy? The nations that spend, or the nations that save? And if you want to keep exploring these hidden layers of perception, subscribe to the channel and stay close.